Okay, if we can all make our way to our seats, we can get the next panel going. Thanks. Just wanted to start with a quick reminder that after this panel concludes, we're going to serve lunch, and if everyone can grab lunch, come back to our seats, we'll hear from Congressman Waxman. And with that, would love to get this panel going. And like last time, if we could just start here and move our way down with brief introductions, and then we'll get into questions.
Okay. I'm Bob Quinn from AT&T.
Dave Schaefer, Cogent Communications.
Peter Pitch, Intel.
Philip Ehrenbroich, the Internet Freedom Business Alliance.
And this is our panel on industry perspectives on the FCC's regulatory options with net neutrality. So the goal being to figure out what you all think are the best options, and as industry experts in your fields, and certainly with your own perspectives, what these different options might mean for how your market plays out, and implications for the market. And so maybe we can just start with that general question. What are the options for net neutrality as you all see it? And then we can get into the effects after that. If you want to start, Bob?
Sure. I mean, I think the options on the table are whether the FCC should redo the rules using the 706 authority that the court affirmed back in 2010. And on the other side of that are a bunch of folks who want to apply the utility regulation provisions of the Communications Act of 1934 under Title II. I think it's a pretty stark choice. But even the proponents of the utility regulation, I think, it's not really clear to me what we would forbear from, what rules would not apply, but they range basically from Chairman, or soon to be, I guess, former Chairman Waxman's proposal that we forbear from all of Title II, we just invoke it in name only, to some of the other groups which want to make sure that we have privacy regulation on internet traffic conducted by the FCC. We want to have rate regulation. So, I mean, it's a wide range of what would be forborne from under the Title II regime. To me, those are the options that are on the table.
Yeah, and Dave, maybe we can get into some of those options and what you see the options are.
Sure. So it first starts with the definition of net neutrality and the need to make sure that all bits are treated equally, not just within a network, but across the boundaries of networks, and that all bits that are treated equally to the applications that are sold by a vertically integrated provider. We are a network operator. We carry the second largest amount of internet traffic in the world, about 20% of the world's traffic, and we are strong proponents of Title II. As an entrepreneur and someone who's started 7 companies, I'm loath to say I'm in favor of regulation, but as a participant in the internet ecosystem, I understand the terminating monopoly nature of a local access network, which is an essential service. It is a utility. And while some sort of hybrid approach could potentially address the issue that we've been facing, that is network congestion that is artificially created by terminating ISPs to preclude certain applications from being delivered to end user customers, I think without the ability to apply Title II broadly and then have that specter of future regulation, these terminating monopolies will look to game the system to preclude companies from selling products and services that are competitive with their vertically integrated products. So we believe that a complete Title II solution is the most likely to pass and also the best for consumers.
Peter?
Sure. First, let me explain Intel's interest we make most of our money in PCs and servers. We make the technologies that make those work. We have a strong interest in promoting policies that foster both widespread, affordable, high-quality broadband and a vibrant edge company ecosystem. The second point I want to make is that we are basically taking an approach embodied in the 2010 rules. We support disclosure, non-discrimination, no blocking, but we think that that approach should accommodate innovation, differentiation, as long as the FCC determines that there is no anti-competitive effect, in particular, no degrading of the existing network and no anti-competitive harm or discrimination against an edge company. We think that's the way most of our economy works. We let people innovate and differentiate if they think it makes sense. That's good for consumers. One size fits all is presumptively bad. But on the other hand, we use tailored rules to try to address competitive harm. Given the overall record, we think that's rule of reason approaches do here. In terms of the legal options and so on, we think both of them have issues, but on net, we like 706 better. We think the Verizon court laid out a template that the FCC can follow. And like Bob, we have lots of concerns about how Title II would apply in practice. There are an awful lot of options on the table. Some of them could be quite counterproductive. And the last thing I'll say is by way of an option. In our reply comment, we filed a suggestion. The Commission asked whether or not there might be safe harbors, presumptions that would help them make expeditious decisions. And the suggestion we made is consistent with a lot of antitrust and FCC precedent. The first thing the Commission should do is determine whether or not the relevant broadband market is competitive. And if it does, then presumptively the service in question would be commercially reasonable. Seems to me that's quite a reasonable approach, and we can talk about what the implications of that might be down the road. Thanks.
Philip?
Sure. So I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit too. I'm Philip Behrenbroich. I'm with the Internet Freedom Business Alliance. We're a relatively new coalition of startups and small businesses that have gotten involved on the net neutrality issue this year. Our companies agree that the FCC needs to put in place strong, legally sustainable open internet rules, and those rules would be rules to prevent blocking and discrimination of web traffic, as well as rules to prevent paid prioritization. I think if you're going back to what Peter just mentioned about the Verizon case in the DC Circuit earlier this year, that court makes pretty clear that the 2010 rules, which had a no blocking provision and a no discrimination provision, that those were common carrier style rules. And to do rules of that sort, you would need to reclassify. If you took a 706 approach, which is what the FCC did in 2010, you would have to allow company ISPs to negotiate deals which would allow them to block, discriminate, and prioritize web traffic. We think that's a non-starter. We think that is not net neutrality. So to answer the question directly, there seems to be really only one approach to achieve net neutrality rules, which is Title II. 706, which would allow for discrimination, prioritization, and blocking, doesn't actually address the issues that web companies and small businesses are concerned about. So Title II is really the only way to get net neutrality rules that are going to stand up in court.
But I disagree with that reading of the Verizon case. I'm going to say that right off the bat. I think that is one advocate's side of the argument that the Verizon case stands for the proposition that the only way to support these net neutrality rules was to reclassify. And I don't believe that that's a fair reading of that case.
That's interesting because that was how I read it. But what was the reading What is the other
Which
reading?
was the way you read it?
Yeah.
I think what the court was, so let's look at paid prioritization, because that seems to be the touch point for a lot of the rules or a lot of the debate that's out there. I think there are ways to construct rules that would prevent the kind of paid prioritization that the public interest groups and the tech companies are most concerned about. And that is the notion that an ISP could unilaterally sell a service and make choices about what should get prioritized over a consumer's last mile internet access line that they have purchased. And we filed, reams of documents and paper at the FCC pointing out that if you took paid prioritization from a user perspective, i.e. that no prioritization can happen on the user's internet access service unless the user has agreed to it. And we've gone so far as to say, look, if you want to say that the user has to pay for it, then say that if that's what you want. But in that sense, what would then happen is you would still be within the court's reasoning, able to establish that there is some differentiation that can occur on the business side of the market while preventing the thing that most people find most pernicious about paid prioritization, i.e. one app works on my internet access service better than another app, and I have no reason, I don't even understand why. And as it turns out, it's because one company is paid for a prioritization capability versus another company that's paid for a prioritization capability. So I don't believe that we wouldn't be having this debate at the commission if everyone came to the table and said, oh, that court said that the only way to do these net neutrality rules is by imposing Title II. We wouldn't be having this debate today, because that's what the court would have said, and then it would have been, we probably have a Title II order by now. But that's not, I just don't believe that that's a fair reading of that act, of that court opinion.
I think Bob's being a bit disingenuous, though, in the pattern and behavior that AT&T has embarked on. As a company that publicly supports net neutrality, paid prioritization is occurring not by creating fast lanes, but slowing the rest of the internet down and then providing an edge provider only one alternative, and that is to enter into a direct agreement with those providers. So AT&T, for example, has embarked upon a policy to limit its connections to the remainder of the internet, to all of the major backbones are having today congestion problems in reaching AT&T's network. So for the edge providers that look to purchase services from companies such as ourselves in a competitive market where there's over a dozen global backbones competing for their business, each of those dozen backbones today has inadequate capacity to get to an end user customer on AT&T's network. Now, AT&T says it's not creating a fast lane. What it's in fact doing is slowing the entire internet down and telling an edge provider that the only way they can get normal speeds is to enter into a direct agreement. I don't know, without a common carrier type of regulatory oversight, how that abuse of market power can be curbed.
I want to jump
well,
back. Can I jump?
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, I'm going to defend your position. So the Verizon case is clear. Look at the case. They rely heavily on the Selco case, right? The FCC was upheld in imposing obligations regarding roaming under the commercially reasonable standard, okay? We know you don't have to impose Title II, okay? The Selco case is out there. The court then harmonized Selco and the case before it and said, okay, fine, if you don't preclude them from engaging in individualized negotiation, then it may be the case that you pass a commercially reasonable standard. So the issue before the commission is really, and take it up 30,000 feet now away from this legal, somewhat arcane debate, what makes sense in this case, a rule of reason or a per se rule? Okay, anyone who has a passing acquaintance with antitrust knows that there are some cases where, 99.99% of the time, something's illegal, it's going to be ruled per se. So that, if we all got in a room, if competitors got in the room and said, let's raise our prices, restrict output, we could go to jail under Section 1 of the Sherman Act, per se illegal. Now look at the rest of antitrust, where courts look at the particular circumstances. Now ask yourself, in a world where we see some of the most effective local competition coming from cable, voice over IP, where they clearly prioritize traffic, do we want to preclude all of that? Because if you really want to just have this one bit, everything gets the same, then let's just get rid of special services too, right? How do you defend it? Indeed, most of the public interest groups argue exactly that. So, rule of reason or a per se rule? It seems to me that's the fundamental question.
So just to jump in a little bit, we kind of transitioned here from a discussion about a legal issue to something that really impacts the business side of the issues that I work on for the startups and small businesses that are part of our coalition. The data roaming rule that Peter mentioned that was upheld in the Selco case, that allowed carriers to negotiate data roaming agreements with other carriers. In this circumstance, we're talking about, to draw an analogy, you'd be talking about a small startup company having to negotiate a carriage agreement to get its traffic to its customers with a large ISP. So you're talking about a Comcast or an AT&T or Verizon. Our companies, I represent companies like Etsy, Tumblr, Reddit, Kickstarter, Dwolla. Dwolla is a small mobile payments processor out in Iowa. These companies have very few attorneys. They might have one, they might have two. These attorneys are not FCC attorneys. So if they're unable to negotiate that individualized carriage agreement for priority or not to be discriminated against or not to be blocked, they're kind of up the creek without a paddle. They, in these circumstances, what happens to these companies is they go away. This is not large. These are not large companies like a Google or like a Netflix, which, if push comes to shove, they can negotiate these sorts of agreements. These are small companies, and they don't have those resources. They don't simply have the manpower on staff to do that. So, I think what works for large companies here, in the data roaming context, is not necessarily the right fit for small businesses and brick and mortar businesses just trying to reach their customers online.
Yeah, let's talk
So I
about
just want to ask you a question, because I'm just curious about that. Are you saying that you want the internet access rates that those companies pay to be regulated?
No, and nobody's asking for that.
So I guess I don't understand where you're coming from on that. If those companies are free to go out and buy internet access service from basically, all of those companies that you name basically buy transiting service, right? And when you buy transiting service, that's like a business internet access service. When you buy that, that gives you access to whoever's selling you that transiting service, basically gives you access to every endpoint on the internet. And those services are available today. So I guess I'm just struggling, and they're available from a multitude of different providers today.
But they're available with defects that are created by terminating monopolies.
So you talk about defects. So Cogent and AT&T have a peering relationship. And let's be very clear about the differences between peering and transit services. When you have a peering relationship, our companies exchange traffic with one another, and there's a lot of parameters to that relationship. Some of the parameters to that relationship are we've got to interconnect across the whole world. We have to have international peering points. We have a limited number of connections in the United States when we peer with another company. We have international. We have to exchange traffic and pipes that are relatively the same size. We have to kind of have the same volume of traffic. And one of the peering principles that we've had out there that have been in place for decades has been that our traffic has to be relatively in balance with one another. I want to give you as much traffic as you're giving me. As a result of that, there's no rate that gets charged between us, but when our traffic levels go up, we each have to supplement our networks to be able to accept each other's traffic. That's a peering relationship. AT&T probably has 24, 25 peers. They are not only with domestic companies like Cogent, but we have peers with people like China Telecom, Japanese telecommunications companies. So the United States doesn't have jurisdiction over all these companies, but we have mutual peering arrangements across the entire world. What my colleague on the left is talking about is he's talking about services that companies buy to get access to the internet in order to be able to access any endpoint on the internet. There's a very distinct class of services. The services that he was referring to are called transiting services. Those services can be bought, his company can buy those services and get access to the customers on my network. He can buy that from 24 other companies in the United States. He can also buy them from what we call content delivery networks. These are networks that have determined that they don't want access to every endpoint on the internet. They only want access to our customers. These are companies like Akamai, who have been Limelight. These companies have been in existence for a long time. They serve high content companies, and they say to individual ISPs, hey, I only want to buy access to your customers, so I don't want to pay a transiting rate because I don't want access to everywhere on the internet. I'm going to get a lower rate than that, and many people refer to that as on-net transiting, right? The problem and the issue that Dave is highlighting is that his company went from being a pure backbone company into the CDN business, and they don't want to pay for the same services that their competitors in the CDN business pay for.
Well, first of all, that's totally incorrect. We do not operate a CDN. We have no servers or hosting, which are operated by CDNs. So Bob's been interesting in representing the facts. First of all, the average bit on the public internet travels 2,700 miles. When we exchange traffic with AT&T, we carry that average bit approximately 2,400 miles. AT&T actually only carries that bit about 300 miles. So I'm not sure that's a completely equitable and fair relationship. Secondly, the nature of their customers are very asymmetric, meaning their customers who they charge send out request bits asking for traffic. They send those request bits to us. We then go grab that content anywhere in the world, and different than what Bob says, we are not a content delivery company. We do not host content, and we bring that traffic back to AT&T. The third point that Bob, I think, alluded to that is factually incorrect is that the paid peering product, i.e. the limitation of connectivity only to their customers, is somehow less expensive than transit. The two companies that he mentioned, Akamai and Limelight, are both customers of ours. They would actually prefer to buy that connectivity from us because it's less expensive. So when they buy transit from Cogent, we do not sell a paid peering product. They get connectivity to the whole internet for a lower cost than they're paying AT&T for connectivity only to their customers. So that is not, in my mind, indicative of a competitive market. The final point that Bob glossed over was the fact that their customers, AT&T customers, are unaware of these decisions that are being made for them and have limited avenues of redress. Those customers, as part of their terms and conditions of service, were required to enter into an arbitration agreement. That precludes them from forming a class and suing. And how fair is it for a consumer who's trying to get access to one of these small applications to then have to spend $1 million to enter into binding arbitration against AT&T?
Let's stay on this topic because I think this is a really interesting way to talk about how these rules are going to affect these markets. We have someone representing these small companies saying, if you don't do effectively, I don't want to use your words incorrectly, but if you don't do Title II, there's a real risk that these small companies are going to go out of business. I'm interested in understanding all your viewpoints on what is going to happen in these markets if you go with 706 versus if you go with Title II, and ranging from small companies to big companies, because Philip, I think, Philip said that the big companies are going to be fine, the small companies are going to be in trouble if you go with 706. So let's do big companies and small companies and Title II versus 706, and we'll work our way back down to Philip.
So that was the point that I was getting at. The issues that Philip has highlighted around paid prioritization are very different than the issues that Dave is talking about with respect to peering relationships that are really worldwide, that involve companies basically across the entire world.
But the costs
Right.
will go up for, the costs, regardless of how they get these arrangements, how they pay for this access, their costs to someone in that chain are going to go up. Is that not accurate?
I don't actually follow the logic of that. That's why I asked Philip the question as to whether or not they were talking about regulating transit rates. They're not. That's not what they're talking about. That's what I heard him say, is that's not what they're talking about. The issue that he has is whether or not ISPs can be permitted to sell prioritization services. As I told you, I think under 706, we can have a rule that is going to make sure that no paid prioritization services happen that are going to be anti-consumer, raise costs, or be anti-business at all. I think you can do that by the consumer choice mechanism that we talked about.
The FCC would go through every one of the, they would deem what's reasonable. That's right, right?
So for one, you'd prohibit at the outset anything where the consumer hasn't agreed to it, right? So there'd be no contracts at all unless the consumer did it. And as I said before, you could even go so far, if you wanted to go so far as to do it, you could say that the user's got to pay for it, in which case all you're really doing is marrying up, the consumer end with the business end on some form of, prioritization service. But in that situation, it's the customer saying, hey, I want to, look, I've got health videos that I'd like to communicate with my doctor, and I want that content prioritized. So in that situation, we'd simply be marrying up two people who are both individually paying for a prioritization service so that they could prioritize the content that, in the end, the consumer wants to prioritize. It could be a gaming company service. It could be any number of different things. But in that world, once again, I don't think that everybody's internet access rates go up. As I say to you before, for the transiting services that the companies that Philip is talking about, they can buy transiting services probably from 30 different companies in the United States in order to get access to any of the large ISPs end users.
Okay, perfect. Dave?
Yeah, so first of all, I totally am supportive of a competitive transit market. AT&T has chosen not to compete in that market because it is perfectly competitive and prices have gotten so low that they have chosen not to go after business in that market. Now, I do believe that small businesses benefit from having the ability to access the entire world on an unfettered basis. I do not believe 706 gives the FCC the authority to ensure that the interconnection between those 30 transit providers that Bob spoke about and AT&T are functioning correctly. The consumers have no ability to redress that, that is the AT&T users. Also, it's important to realize that in virtually all markets, the ISP is either a monopoly or at best a duopoly in delivering this service. So the consumers have little choice and have no visibility into this behavior. To the edge providers, the small businesses, they benefit in a robust competitive market. If our market became as concentrated as the terminating access monopolies, we should be regulated, but we are not. We are today competitive. And without imposing some kind of strict form of oversight on those terminating monopolies, they will circumvent the intent of the law, which is to promote the internet and treat all bits equally. They've already done it through the point of interconnection. They may potentially do it through predatory usage caps. That would also be something that would not be addressable under 706. Whereas with the ability to impose Title II, it would give the FCC the ability, not the obligation, to review all areas in which bits are being manipulated or prioritized.
Utility regulation.
So I
So
want to.
can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Just a few quick points. I think Dave's argument would be a lot more persuasive if Akamai supported Title II. They don't. Two, the small edge market companies, if Intel thought that the edge company market, the edge ecosystem, were going to become less vibrant, less innovative, we would not be supporting our position. It's that simple. We just look at the server market and how fundamental it is to our business. It's driven by data. If that ecosystem were to become less vibrant, we wouldn't be taking this position. Second or third point, I think Philip's argument proves too much. Just think of this hypothetical. Assume that the commission were to adopt the original rules under 706 and a new service were offered and it was not degrading the network, the provider in question, and there was no anti-competitive harm against any particular edge company in a traditional sense of anti-competition. Would we then still want to preclude that new service, whether it was a health service, education service, or just a better provision of high-definition movies? No, of course not. We wouldn't put our thumbs on the scale in the marketplace to favor small companies just because they're small. We have a lot of experience with that, by the way. It's called the Robinson-Patman Act. You know, you can go back, those of you who don't know it, you should go back and look at that history, and that ought by itself give you some pause. It is. It's just on a bipartisan basis held in low regard.
So I don't think that I said at any point that we should give special treatment to small businesses. I'm simply asserting that when you allow for discrimination and prioritization and allow companies to pay for deals that would allow them to opt out of that sort of behavior by ISPs, you are by definition going to be favoring larger firms with deeper pockets. So
You're
to
saying
get
that economies
to get
of
to
scale
the
shouldn't be allowed to work in the marketplace? Should Intel be limited in the number of microprocessors it makes so that there can be 10 microprocessor firms in the world instead of 3 or 4?
well, that's neither here nor there. That's a little bit off topic, but
No, I think it's directly on point.
I think Peter's point fails to take into account the innovation and entrepreneurship and economic growth that the internet since its inception provides. The internet, if you're a one-person business, you can scale up and all of a sudden have 100,000 users or customers. The brick and mortar world in which Peter's company largely operates isn't, it's not quite that dynamic as much as he would like to believe. And just kind of getting back to the question at hand, what happens if the FCC takes a 706 approach? What happens if the FCC takes a Title II approach? So let's start with 706. So from the perspective of if you're a small company, a small startup with 2 or 3 people, no legal staff, or a Main Street small business. For instance, I work with the National Association of Realtors. Most realtors in this country are 1 or 2 person small proprietorships. They've weighed in the docket saying, look, we need strong enforceable rules that'll stand up in court because we're worried that the virtual reality video tours that we now stream on our websites, or the high-resolution photographs that take a lot of bandwidth on our sites, are going to be blocked or discriminated against, and we're going to have to pay more to get to customers that just want to, take a home tour on their lunch break before they go to an open house on a Sunday. So those sorts of companies, if you allow for a world under 706 where you can have blocking, discrimination, and prioritization, it just creates uncertainty for them. It creates a world where they're worried all the time about whether their traffic is going to be blocked, whether their traffic will be throttled, whether their closest competitor is going to be able to sign a priority deal, which will speed up that traffic and slow down their own traffic. That's the world under 706. It's not a pretty place. Under Title II, you have more certainty, which for small businesses, you've seen this in the docket with the letters filed by venture capital investors. They've said, in a 706 world, you have uncertainty, and it makes us want to invest less in web companies. We'll look at web companies that have already negotiated these priority deals, and other companies are just going to be out of luck. If you talk to entrepreneurs, if you talk to people who are software engineers who left their cushy jobs at, making a lot of money at a company like Apple or a company like Intel, for instance, these people are not leaving those jobs and those pay packages and those stock options for a world of uncertainty where they don't think that they can have a two-person business that can go out and find a market, especially if they have to make a deal with a large ISP that's got market power that can, basically make a decision instantly to throttle their traffic or block their traffic. So yeah, that's the world we're talking about. That's the choice we're looking at.
We'll get back. We've gone through everyone. Let's open up for questions from the audience. Do we have any questions out there? It doesn't seem. Dave, I have a question for you, and we'll get back to this topic. But I wanted to ask, is interconnection going to be part of the next net neutrality rule that comes out? Do you think it is going to be? And then we can go through what other people think about that.
Sure. So, interconnection is something that's opaque to the end user and something that had not been previously opined on by the FCC. I think in either the hybrid approach, the FCC would assert its jurisdiction over interconnection once it was made aware of the abuses that the terminating monopolies have, in fact, impacted on the market. Under Title II, it would be overt, and they would clearly have interconnection as one of the areas in which they would have regulatory authority. It's a little bit like that game you play when you're a kid, whack-a-mole. You knock it down in one place, it comes back somewhere else. So, every company, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, are all in favor of net neutrality. But it'd be a little bit like asking Vladimir Putin, I'm in favor of world peace. His definition of peace and ours isn't quite the same. The definition that AT&T has is a very narrow one, and it's abused the interconnection. It's interesting, Bob talked about the equitable nature of the relationship. The reality is there is no congestion on the internet. The bits travel at the speed of light. There is no better service for paid prioritization. All of the bits in the world, unless there is an artificial constraint, travel in glass at 133,000 miles per second, 186,000 miles a second in free space. That's the speed at which the internet operates. The blockages that have occurred because of an attempt to extract tolls at the point of interconnection have created the need to sell a paid prioritization product.
So, yeah, let's go. Interested, is interconnection going to be in the next net neutrality rules?
I don't know, because I don't know what the rules are going to be. I don't divine to know. But I will tell you that Chairman Wheeler has specifically said on repeated occasions that interconnection issues are not net neutrality. I don't have a narrow view of net neutrality. It's just because, listen, I was the person that negotiated AT&T's first net neutrality condition back in 2006 when we did the Bell South merger. Net neutrality then was all about prioritization in the last mile. That's what it's always been. It's not me who's trying to change the definition of net neutrality. Chairman Wheeler came into the office and observed net neutrality and interconnection are completely separate issues. It's Dave who's trying to expand the definition of net neutrality in order to include the particular issues that he's identified with respect to his company. And the other thing that I would observe in response to Philip is we've had net neutrality rules under Section 706 since 2010. Where's all the blocking? Where is the National Association of Realtors having all kinds of issues getting people to view their traffic? I mean, we have the same rules in place today in 2010 under Section 706. The court vacated the rules. Every ISP is continuing to abide by those rules. I don't think we have a real dispute about the rules. What we have a dispute about is what's the jurisdiction going to be. And under Title II, as much as Philip and Dave would like you to believe that Title II prohibits discrimination, you got to read the statute. It prohibits unreasonable discrimination. By definition, Title II is a case-by-case analysis. And that's by definition. It's no different than what they tried to enact under Section 706. And if you don't believe me, go look at Wheeler's remarks. I'll be happy to give you Wheeler's remarks where he has repeatedly said, people like to talk about Title II as being able to be used to prohibit discrimination. That's not what the statute says. It says they can prohibit unreasonable discrimination. And so I don't think we have I'll leave the cogent issues aside. I don't think we have a dispute about the rules. I think what we have a dispute about is what the jurisdictional basis is. And by the way, if Congress were to pass a law that basically said, we're going to take that issue off the table, we're going to declare Title X and say that's the jurisdiction to pass the very same rules we have in 2010, is everybody in agreement? Are we all good to go at that point? I'll bet not.
Yeah.
Sorry, kind of a theoretical question for Mr. Schaefer, but it sounds like we're painting a picture where Mr. Quinn has a pretty enviable business position in terms of pricing power. So I guess the question for Cogent is, why not extend the lines directly to the households and capture that last mile benefit for yourself?
Sure, and you've actually got to the root of the problem. We've talked about the symptom here today, which is net neutrality, but the root of the problem is Mr. Quinn's company and his competitors have, for the most part, obsolete outside plant, and they are trying to extract additional revenue off of that plant and foreclose anyone from building a new plant. So first of all, building a local access network is a natural monopoly. Actually, at Cogent, 53% of our revenues come from our local access network. I'm in the exact same business as AT&T for over half of my revenues. But the problem is you can't generate an adequate return unless you have complete market share. So in the US, we have two types of plant, twisted pair and hybrid fiber coax. As it turns out, by dumb luck, hybrid fiber coax is a better plant for broadband. It's not an optimal plant, but it's a better plant. So in the 15% of the country that has had overbuilding with fiber, what we have seen is those two fiber overbuilders, Verizon and Google, have generated a 0% IRR. So if you look at the demographics of the US, 15% of the country probably can't cost effectively be served without massive subsidies. 70% could be served with a viable fiber product that has not yet been served, and 15% has been served under an open market approach where the cost is proportional to the homes or businesses passed, the revenue is proportional to homes or businesses served. So as an overbuilder coming in and building fiber to every premise, you end up finding that you get a third of the market. and therefore you're unprofitable. The only solution will be a structurally separated company with franchises, promulgated rates, and it should be treated as a natural utility and be separated from the company that is the application layer. AT&T has chosen to not invest in its plants adequately. It's diverted that capital by investing it in its mobile business. It's buying a satellite business. It's buying a Mexican carrier. And it's paying out an unsustainable dividend to its shareholders. Those are its choices. But it has chosen to cede its dominant market monopoly position and finds itself today in a position where it cannot overbuild, and no competitor can come in with private capital and overbuild as well.
That's a modest proposal.
That's late
Europe,
regulation,
yeah,
folks.
Europe, many European countries have adopted a much more regulatory approach, far short of that, and they have 43% per capita in network investment that we have in the United States. Okay, the other side of the coin for Intel is we want these companies to make this extremely risky, expensive, last mile investment, right? Again, if we thought that that would be injured or wouldn't be injured by Title II, we'd be for it too. Because we're back in the middle. We support rules that, on a rule of reason, case-by-case basis, have the commission looking at particular deals with facts before it of what actually is going to happen, and they determine, is there have there been complaints about degrading of the network? Is there some unfair discrimination against an edge company? Is there some anti-competitive effect? Seems to me this approach, this rule of reason approach, has an awful lot to going for it in this very complex, uncertain situation we find ourselves in.
All right, I think,
you know,
we got
I-
one more,
yeah,
one last, let's go, Phil, one last question, then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, so I mean, if I appreciate Peter's point, but if this investment were so inherently risky, why last week did we hear executives from Comcast, Verizon, Charter, Time Warner Cable say, and if Title II were such an onerous burden, why would executives from those four carriers have said at the UBS investor conference last week, Title II doesn't change anything for us on investment, it still gives us plenty of price flexibility. It doesn't seem like it's that scary of an investment, and it doesn't seem like Title II is all that onerous if they're making those promises to their shareholders.
That's not what they said.
So,
That's definitely not what your CEO said.
I was at that conference too, and every one of them said Title II is a deal breaker. They would not accept it in any way, shape, or form.
I'm
was
sorry,
right
that's not
there.
what the transcript said.
I
so
was there live. I
apologize.
saw what they said.
But secondly, you know, Mr. Quinn trotted out some pretty tired talking points a second ago, and I just want to push back on him. You know, I feel like, you know, the docket has pretty well addressed these issues, and I want to address them here now as well. He has alluded to the fact that, you know, there are, quote, you know, no problems with blocking or discrimination, that this is a solution in search of a problem, which, you know, we've heard that a lot. You know, AT&T is one of the bad actors here. You know, they have blocked Google Wallet on their network because they had a proprietary product that they couldn't get to market fast enough. We have a company that we work with called Dwolla. They're a mobile payments processor. They're very small. If Google Wallet is blocked, someone will wait around for that service. Anytime that a small company's service is blocked or application is blocked, usually those customers are an issue of first impression. And when that happens, they don't go back. So this is an issue for small businesses like a Dwolla, and you know it's disingenuous to say that there aren't any problems. I mean, AT&T didn't have to live, the wireless side at least didn't have to live under the 2010 rules for the most part. You know, and before the 2010 rules, you know, there were instances where they blocked Skype because it competed with their products. They blocked Apple FaceTime because it competed with their products. So you know, there are instances of issues here where, you know, for a small company this can be make or break. And then the second point, which was that you know, Title II can't prevent prioritization or discrimination. Well, the rule, the 201, 202, 208 on their face, yes, they don't. They allow for, they say that you can't have unreasonable discrimination. When the FCC writes its rules, it can make a determination of what unreasonable discrimination is and is not. And that is where the FCC would have authority to prevent blocking, discrimination, and paid prioritization. So
You're saying that they can write a rule that goes farther than their statutory authority?
I'm saying that the statutory authority gives them the authority to decide, to define what is and
unreasonable
is
means
not
no?
reasonable.
Let's get one last question before we wrap the panel up.
This is a question for Mr. Schaefer. If your client's traffic went up 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, do you think it's reasonable that you would have to pay the terminating ISP higher rates?
No, for 2 reasons. First of all, we carry the traffic the majority of the distance. Secondly, the only traffic we send to those ISPs is traffic that their paying customers receive. So in the telephone world, after 120 years of litigation, AT&T was finally forced to agree by regulation to bill and keep as the revenue model for the industry. The internet has always worked as a bill and keep model, and what AT&T is trying to do with paid prioritization is revert back to a model without bill and keep. So the answer is traffic volume directionality doesn't matter. Aggregate volume does matter. We have gone as far as to agree not only to pay the cost of upgrading the physical ports necessary on our side of the network, but we've made the offer. I actually flew down to Dallas and made it to their senior executives that Cogent would pay the capital cost for AT&T, since I guess it's capital constrained, to upgrade those ports. And they have refused to take us up on that offer.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. That wraps up the panel. We'll break for lunch, and then we'll come back for Congressman Waxman.